A slip dress has been part of a woman's wardrobe in the 30s, 40s, 50s, even 60s. Although not a staple anymore, you can wear it to sleep. It's great underneath anything sheer or dresses with very low necklines, skirts with very high slits. Because it's breathable and light, it's great for hot summer days worn with a skirt, for example, or even without. And let's not forget this iconic swimwear moment. I guess what I'm trying to say is it's very versatile, and even in impromptu sort of moments, it's effortlessly chic. If you're new here, I'm making a wardrobe from scratch, film tutorials, research, and talk about the garments I make. I just finished my first underwear set, and I think this negligé slip dress is an ideal transition to the leisure wear stuff. I'll talk about these terms and their history in a bit, but it is a garment that is very easy to make, and by easy I mean that it does require time and patience, but there's nothing too overwhelming here. I'll guide you through all of the steps. It's great, it's glamorous, it all starts with a pattern. And I know that especially for beginners it seems like a hassle, but hear me out. I made a free PDF with instructions on how to construct this pattern for your own measurements so that it would fit you perfectly. You can adjust the length and the décolletage to the way you want it to be. The drafting process is a bit like connecting dots essentially. This pattern works for a short slip mostly. If you want to make it longer, you'd have to add some sort of slits or make the skirt flare out a bit more. But this is the short version, the easy version, because it doesn't require any. This pattern is built with the elasticity of the fabric that you choose in mind, because the slip dress, it's going to be cut on bias. Bias cut garments have a bit of a stretch, they are less stiff, drape beautifully, and essentially move with the body. Those were very popular in the 30s, had a revival in the 90s. With a bias cut one needs quite a bit more fabric generally, that's why these pieces tend to be very pricey. And with negligés, combinations, camisoles, this technique comes in very handy to create a very slinky, smooth undergarment. Right, so this edge here on your fabric indicates the direction of the weave. Woven fabrics, unless there's some elastic fiber in there, they will barely stretch in these directions. On the diagonal though, what we call on bias, it will be a bit stretchy. This line here, the grain line, indicates how to align this pattern on your fabric. So now see all the width are in a 45-degree angle and thereby stretchy. This will make the waist portion as narrow as possible, but so that you'd still be able to step into the dress and stretch it over your hips. At the bust line as well, it's meant to sit rather tight, stretched, so that eventually we won't need any additional darts to form the fabric over this area. I added 1 cm seam allowance to my pattern pieces. I find this makes the cutting experience much easier and more precise rather than marking the seam allowance on the fabric. I chose a silk satin. You absolutely have to pre-wash your fabric. I've been there many times where I carved out some time for sewing, prepared everything but forgot to wash the fabric beforehand. Don't skip that step, it can affect the way the garment behaves later on, the way the seams connect, because it can shrink. And also, especially with silk satin, it usually has some sort of coating on it, which goes away when you wash it. Then I pressed my silk. It is best pressed while it's still a bit damp. Cutting is definitely my least favorite part. I'm just really bad at it, especially when I have to cut fabrics that are as slinky as silk. So to make my life as easy as possible, I'm using a rotary cutter, and I actually used to cut directly on my table, mostly because of laziness, but also because I never felt like getting an actual cutting board or cutting mat, because they're kind of ugly and bulky. But in the end it was a great investment. Cutting on a table with a rotary cutter is a really bad idea. You'll ruin your table, but you'll also ruin your blades, and you'd have to change them constantly. And the cutting board, I just store it behind my furniture so it's out of sight. Before I cut into the fabric, I gently pull it back on the grain line so that it's not already stretched once I'm cutting. And now that it's prepared, I can find the right way to align my pattern pieces. It is important that they are mirrored. It's best you don't cut them out like that. Because of this diagonal stretch, the pieces would sort of equal each other out when you mirror them like that. So I'm just trying to find the best position to save as much fabric as I can, and I cut it out. My pattern has markings, the bust line, waistline, hip line and the center. To find those later to connect my pieces properly, I'm cutting little markings into the fabric. I think it's a bit more precise that way rather than using chalk. Before I'm lifting my piece from the cutting board, I'm going to Staystitch all the edges. These stitches will be taken out later, but once again, because this is such a slinky and rather big piece, as soon as I'm going to lift it or transfer it to the machine, the lines will get completely distorted. And I know that, especially for beginners, sewing by hand might seem like an annoyance, but I promise that this preparation will make the process easier later on. It is done to somewhat stabilize the length of the edges. And I make one continuous stitching line on each edge. Here in these areas, depending on the fullness of your bust, I recommend to make the stitch very tight, without creating any folds or ruffles, but to almost shrink the fabric back at this point that is being stretched over the bust line. Look, I know there is a trend currently to drag this type of garments. Homeware today is either one's regular day clothes or maybe some sort of athleisure. So I think it's not that easy for us to place these, to name these. Nightgowns, dressing gowns is commonly used. In different languages there's slips, combinations, negligés, baby dolls. These are umbrella terms for a type of undergarment that is also a dress, kind of. It seems that this dress is a natural progression of a chemise, a rather wide garment that's been worn closest to the skin, but there's only a vague relation. What we're making here today, in German it would be called a negligé. It translates to neglected and was initially used to describe the state of someone who is uncoiffed, unpresentable, not ready yet to receive any visitors. It came later to be applied to non-formal, non-courtly dresses or ensembles that were meant for the privacy of a bedroom, dressing room or a boudoir. In aristocratic circles, these rooms were semi-private, however, the daily happenings highly ceremonious, so this type of loungewear was still rather modest, decorated and presentable in alignment with current fashions. Most importantly, it was not meant as underwear, it was separate casual or leisure wear. And theoretically, that's the closest depiction of how I understand and use this garment, since I spent so much time at home, and especially since lockdown, I found that having something separate and cozy to wear is very important, just for my headspace, I suppose. Obviously, there is this whole seductive connotation that comes with it that I'm going to talk about some other time, because I find that it's mostly about being presentable and put together and pretty for oneself. It certainly feels very glamorous while it's still very easy and comfy to wear, and I think there's just something very cool about throwing a coat over it and be out of the house. This could be part of an ensemble with a matching dressing gown worn over it, for example. In English and French, negligés were and are still understood as lounging or sleeping ensembles rather than a dress. It seems many of these terms are more about describing the use of the garment rather than the garment itself. And in contrast to athleisure that obviously derives from athletic wear, I think it just also puts one in a slightly different mood, a bit less sporty. In Russian, combinations is still commonly used. Those were very popular in the 1910s and 20s, being a combination of drawers and a camisole. Those were actually closed or could be closed in the crotch area. So it's probably one of those terms that stuck since the revolution, because there wasn't really place for evolvement in that bourgeois, frivolous department, and it's still being applied to anything that's longer and lacy and silky today, although combinations actually describes a very specific type of underwear. Technically speaking, the proper term for a garment like this would be a one-piece slip. A full slip would look like a dress, kind of. Those developed by the 1930s, when body-conscious bias-cut dresses dominated fashion. Intimate apparel sometimes looked similar to evening wear during the 1930s, with the difference that those were usually embellished with lace, for example. But this overall fitted bias-cut silhouette with a slightly flared skirt stayed rather the same. Those were not worn instead of underwear, but rather over it to make the actual underwear a bit less apparent, with dresses that were a bit sheer maybe. Kind of like an extra lining. It was very much about it being inconspicuous underneath clothes. A half slip would be an underskirt essentially. A very short slip dress would be a camisole accordingly, but I'll come back to those later. Slips were very popular and very much needed in the 30s, 40s, 50s, a time when nylon stockings were basically mandatory. So a slip was also very helpful to prevent the static cling that usually comes with nylon stockings, but also with pantyhose. When a dress or a skirt is unlined, a slip is in fact very helpful with the overall fit. Now, with a slip dress like this, you can proceed in many different ways. If you choose to make it a bit more sleek, maybe you can sew these pieces together and just top stitch the edges, or use a fake roll hem, or make a scalloped edge maybe. But I find, although it's maybe counterintuitive, that trimming it with lace is far less fiddly and easier to do. So before connecting the front and the back, I'm going to add the lace to the top of my pieces. I've chosen this lace. It is tulle with floral patterns embroidered on it. It has lashes on both sides. It was advertised as Chantilly lace. Technically, it is a fairly standard polyester knit lace. It is symmetrical on both edges. If you're just starting out, I highly recommend using a trimming that is symmetrical because it's much easier to align. However, if your lace isn't, there are also definitely ways to connect it beautifully and in interesting ways, but it's a bit more complicated. This lace was actually pink initially, but I dyed it black to fit my silk, so that's always an option. It is a bit stretchy because it is a net essentially, but it's not an elastic lace. And for this sort of simple lace trimmed slip, we're going to add it to the top and the bottom edges. Right, so I'm going to use my pattern as a guide here. I find the right side and I start with the center. I just take both ends of my lace and put them together over each other. At this point, I'm figuring out what angle to use, where they would meet at the center, what kind of shape the overlapping is creating, the shape that happens at the neckline, the shapes that are created by the negative space, so on your fabric essentially. You can obviously also make it go lower or flatter than your pattern. You can certainly make your neckline straight as well if you want to. It really all depends on your preferences, on your lace. There are just a lot of options. I personally find that, especially at the center, it looks very neat and pretty when you overlap the lace like that. So I'm pinning them together and I'm going to connect them following the edge of the respective overlapping lace. For that, I'm going to use a narrow zigzag stitch. This will hold the net of the lace securely and close off the raw edges. And I stitch my overlapping on the right side and on the wrong side, carefully tracing the edge of the lace. I'm cutting the leftover lace very closely to the stitch. Be careful not to cut into any lashes of the overlapping lace accidentally, but if you do, it's probably good luck anyway. Now I'm going to cut the ends that are pointing towards my straps and try and figure out how I want to connect the lace on the sides. Here it's very important to find a way to connect the trimming on the sides so that it'll end directly at the top edge of your pattern, but also at the edge of the side seam, minus the seam allowance, because that's where it's going to join the back piece eventually. And sometimes with a wavy edge, it can be quite difficult to find the right balance. Here the negative space is also very important. It will sort of dictate the overall shape of the neckline. I found a way to connect these, but so that the edge just barely ends at the actual seam, but I think it will work out. I would usually connect these lace pieces with a straight stitch at the strap, but I actually really like the shape that emerges here by this overlapping. I think this might look quite interesting. So I decided to connect these by overlapping them as well. I connected them on all 4 edges. Now I'm just going to double check how this is going to be connected to the front. So in the center it will be roughly 2 centimeters lower, and the straps are ending at the edge to my seam allowance. The lace for the back, since the back ends in an almost straight line, I'm not going to shape it in any way, so I'm just trying to find a symmetrical way that works with this wavy edge, and I'm going to make this point here, right where the flower is, my center back. Now everything is prepared. I'm going to start and align the front first. The center will be roughly 2 centimeters lower. I make sure that the edges fit. At the straps, because I've shrunk this line here, it will align a bit differently than it does on the pattern because it's now a bit shorter. So at this point the fabric almost has a life of its own. I'm basting the lace to the fabric and sort of tap on it gently to make sure that there is no tension, and I baste close to the edge and also secure the overlapping center. This is why I prefer working with lace. I think it's very forgiving. It takes time, but it's much less fiddly in my opinion than making a rolled hem, for example, where you can very clearly see any mistake or when anything is crooked, which happens to me almost inevitably, especially when I'm working with something slinky like silk satin. At the back I also aligned it to my center marking, and now I'm going to stitch the lace on the machine, tracing this edge here, again with the same narrow zigzag stitch. I'm doing it very slowly, drop my needle, rotate, stitch, drop again, just carefully tracing this edge. And it's quite meditative actually. I didn't even listen to music or an audiobook or anything, because it's like driving. You're kind of left alone with your thoughts. So this is what that looks like. You're basically supposed to not be able to see anything. On the reverse, however, there's my stitching. I'm going to transfer the markings of my straps onto the lace here, because now we're going to cut back the fabric. Close to the stitching, roughly 5 millimeters next to it. This always makes me nervous. Be careful, use your fingers as your second pair of eyes here. Feel the edge of your scissors. Try not to cut into your lace accidentally. I remember when I started sewing, it was always about the edges being serged off or closed off so that they won't fray, but later I learned that many edges are being left alone, and with lace inserts in haute couture, that's how it's usually done. I guess here it's more about making the lace become one with the textile. And if you're still worried, I'm going to show you an example. I've been wearing this for 10 years, I believe, and it's been in the washing machine quite a few times, but see the edges, they'll be fine, don't worry about it. The zigzag stitch prevents fraying, even if it's very narrow like the one I'm using here. This is what the trimming looks like finished on the back. When working with lace that has scalloped edges on both sides rather than a straight one, this transition, I think it just looks beautiful when the fabric almost merges with the lace in an organic line. I'd say it's quite apparent that it's the lace that transforms this garment into underwear. I guess it's partly due to this hide-and-seek nature of it, the overall delicacy it signals. Lace in itself, through our modern lens anyway, is perceived as something very feminine. If it's black, it's seductive. If it's colorful lace, and especially white, it can be read as even pure and girlish, virtuous even. That was not always the case, of course. The implementation of lace in men's wardrobe started to decline in the late 18th, early 19th centuries with the decline of the Rococo taste. The classic male tailoring, now so universally familiar, was originally neoclassic. It was invented and perfected just when the simplest visual motives in classical design were suggesting the force and clarity of Greek democracy and Roman technology. From there on, lace, frilliness, overt decoration became something to be associated mostly with women, while men would mostly appear like sleek, austere, shadowy figures, almost blending in their uniformity. This tendency in fashion was termed the Great Masculine Renunciation by Flügel, a British psychoanalyst. An interesting notion, as if men at some point collectively decided to just quit anything that looked too silly, that looked like they're trying too hard, creating this sort of imbalanced portrayal, nurturing this myth about obsessive female vanity. Of course, men's clothes and sartorial decisions had and have a very intricate, ornate language of their own. A fashion historian whom I quoted before argues that women were always one step behind, so to speak, trying to imitate this sort of clarity. And in this process, it seemed for a while like anything frilly and lacy was almost banished to the innate privacy of one's bedroom or for special occasions. In the 90s, of course, underwear was revisited as actual outerwear. Materials, techniques, references to lingerie started to become very popular, though in high fashion and performance mostly, and the slip became very fashionable as an actual dress. While there was still a sort of spectrum, right? Sometimes it was dresses that were simply silky, bias cut and had narrow straps, but still also alluding to this femme fatale, boudoir aesthetic in a laissez-faire, neglected sort of way, I'd argue. I also had to think about this Friends episode where Rachel tries to convince her love interest's parents that this was a very new fashionable dress and not a negligé that she wore to seduce their son. The most iconic slip dress moment award goes to Lady Diana. She wore it to the Met Gala, I believe, and it was designed by John Galliano, who had been recently appointed as head designer for the Dior brand and who's also very much responsible for popularizing bias cut. I think the lace makes all the difference here. Without it, this would be perceived as a regular dress, right? Not too far off from any other red carpet dress. So it's like there is an invisible balance there of how sheer, how revealing, how long, how lacy, and how it's styled. Slips were also and still are very much popular in the subgenre of fashion that I'm going to generally call rock chic, mainly in the grunge spectrum of it. Here it's almost always being counterbalanced with some chunky boots or leather jackets. I think it purposefully sends mixed messages and challenges the expression of femininity, actively contrasts the perceived fragility but also seductive femininity of the slip dress. Let me show you another relic of the past. In the early mid-2000s, it became very fashionable to wear camisoles. Initially, those are regular tops with narrow straps, but here again the lace makes all the difference. Trimming stuff with lace like t-shirts, jeans was one of the many capricious whims of that strange time in fashion. Since then it became socially acceptable to wear these very much lingerie-coded tops as outerwear on a broader level. Maybe that's just my teenage lens, but there was something very unapologetically teenage girlish about this time in fashion. It was very much about experimenting with everything. On picture day, I might have worn a half-slip inspired skirt over jeans with a hoodie on top. But that's a rumor. I think especially with slip dresses, those can be combined beautifully with layers. And I love lace. I think styling is very important here. To me, it's garments like these that don't change, not in a lifetime anyway, while fashions and styling do. And this is what I'm trying to achieve with this whole making my own wardrobe thing. I already stitched the lace to the front, and before cutting it, I'm going to lay it next to my back piece. Because of my angle at the front here, they won't connect smoothly in one continuous line. So rather than making it even more obvious, I'm going to make another stitch that's roughly at the height of the lace in my back, a second edge to cut my fabric basically. This sort of thing really depends on your lace, on the angle you choose, on your pattern, by extension on your measurements. This might not even be an issue for you, but that's how I deal with something like that, and that's the trimming on my front finished. Before trimming the hem, we need to connect these pieces. And what I've seen being recommended a lot, what I used to do with anything bias cut for a while, was to simply connect these pieces with a zigzag stitch and leave them be. Because the edge is on bias, it won't fray and the seam would stay somewhat stretchy. Another easy way would be to use an overlock stitch, which will also ensure a bit of elasticity. But the way I've seen it done in the luxury segment, again, like on a camisole by Karin Gilson, for example. If you look them up on eBay, where people also photograph the inside because it shows the label or something, you can clearly see that they use a French seam. There is still a bit of elasticity there, just due to the nature of silk, I suppose. And I think it works because it's a fairly loose garment, so there's just not as much pulling on the seam anyway. It's just really much nicer to look at. It feels softer on the skin. It's not too complicated, but it's an extra step. First, I connect and baste the edges together on the right side. So very counterintuitively, the right sides of my dress are facing me. Then on the machine, I stitch the pieces together close to the edge. I'm using the foot of my machine as a guide here. It's about 4 millimeters close to the edge. Now I'm turning this slip inside out, and with my fingers I'm pressing the seam slightly, and I sew again, this time 6 millimeters close to the edge. Now voila, this is a French seam. It's also sometimes called a lingerie seam. Everything's neat on the inside and I'm going to press this seam open now. We're going to make some straps now. First you'd need to find out the length that you need. I usually do that by taking some ribbons and pinning them to the markings for the straps on the back, and I try it on to find the right length. Okay, I think it comes along beautifully, but this part here where the overlapping happens on the skin, it's definitely much more imposing than I thought it would be. Like I said, you can definitely connect the lace here with a rather simple stitch. Here on this slip I did it like that, for example. I'm going to show you how to connect lace securely without overlapping in a bit when I'm going to do the trimming for the hem. For now I'm going to measure how long my straps have to be, plus a bit extra. I'll make it an even 50 centimeters. Sometimes for slip dresses like these, spaghetti straps are used, which are very thin but have a bit of a profile, and I'd actually like for them to be as flat, as soft as possible, so I'm going to make flat straps. For that I'm cutting out 2 strips of fabric on the grain line. I'll make them 5 millimeters wide plus 5 millimeter seam allowance on both edges, so it's gonna be 2 centimeters in total. And I stitch these strips on the wrong side on the machine while folding. I align the fold to the foot of my machine to make sure that it's really the fold and not the seam allowance that guides my stitch here. That way I think the width stays continuous. Now I'm going to turn them over. You can use some special tools for that. I usually cut it slightly into an angle at the ends. I take a strong yarn and knot it at the end of my seam a few times. Then I push the head of my needle through the opening and just push to the other end and pull on it to finally turn it over. Because silk is so smooth, it actually works really well. I connect them to the back first, where my markings are. First to the fabric with a narrow zigzag stitch, following the stitch that's already there, and with just a few hand stitches to the lace as well. Now I recommend to try it on again and pin the right length and angle. Our bodies, our shoulders are a bit uneven, so it's always better to try it on rather than relying on a number. As you can see, I definitely overestimated the length here, but again I stitch it with a narrow zigzag stitch to the silk and with a few hand stitches to the lace, and just cut my straps back at an angle. Before hemming, it is very important to let your negligee hang for at least 2 days. The fabric just needs a bit of time to fall into position. This is also why the hem on this pattern is a simple straight line rather than a curved one. And this is because of the bias cut. The fabric will usually sort of droop and stretch out slightly, so we need to let it rest and do its thing. In the meantime, I'm going to prepare the lace trimming for the hemline. I measure how long it has to be on my pattern, and I try to find a way with this scalloped edge in mind to make it go in one continuous line once I connect it, so that there won't be any obvious interruption in this wavy edge. The overlapping, where it would be perfectly inconspicuous, happens slightly outside of my initial pattern line. So here I'm actually going to prioritize the lace edge and make my trimming slightly longer than it has to be. It'll be roughly 1 centimeter longer. Since the hemline is a bit stretchy, I can get away with it without causing any major tension. So now I'm just going to connect it on the machine. It's definitely better to make the trimming rather slightly longer, but these things once again will depend on your pattern and on the lace and on the rapport of the lace you choose. And this is a very secure way to connect lace in general if you don't want to make it overlap. First I stitch it together with a regular straight stitch. Now I'm going to press this seam open and I'm going to sew directly over it with a narrow zigzag stitch. This will secure the net of the lace, and now I can just cut back the ends. So this lacy ring, this is going to be my trimming. Fast forward to now, my hem has drooped slightly but evenly into a curve. Don't skip this step. Sometimes, although mostly with larger, wider, more voluminous pieces, it can happen that it droops in an uneven, wavy way. Then you'd have to cut the hemline and make it even again. Though definitely try it on and check beforehand. It always looks different on a hanger than it does on our bodies. I'm now going to mark my lace ring into 4 equal parts by folding and pinning it to be able to distribute it evenly on the hemline. While pinning it, I'm going to make sure that the lowest part of my edge here is always going to be about 5 millimeters higher than the edge of my fabric, because I want for this lace to sort of extend the length of my dress slightly. And first I pin my markings accordingly to the side seams and then to the center front and center back. Sometimes it's easier to work on hems while the garment is hanging, because that way you can control it a bit better so that there is no tension happening. But I actually pinned all the lowest parts of my lace beforehand, and now you guessed it, I'm going to baste it. So business as usual, I'm going to stitch it now with a narrow zigzag stitch along the edge. The stakes are high now. To me it feels like finishing a garment, even if it's just some minor things like sewing on buttons or finishing the hem. It almost takes up as much energy as all the hours you've put into it already. I really hope you'll be able to see anything here. I chose a black slip to start with because to me, especially a black slip is kind of a staple, and I think some of you might agree, but I'm cutting my silk back, same as before. I really think it's a rather easy, although lengthy endeavor. However, in the end, it only took me about 2 days. I actually came to like this overlapping here. I think it emphasizes this sweetheart shape. I hope this inspires you to make something like that for yourself. Depending on the lace, on the fabric you choose, on the colors you choose, you know, the design process of it all will create a different type of slip dress with a different character. And I'm going to show you a more elaborate, a bit more fiddly way to create a slip dress with this pattern in the next video. Bye!